Now, it should come as no surprise that color schemes in Sublime Text are all about applying colors to text. And so far in this video series, we've covered topics like what color schemes are, how we could create our own, and even how we could make modifications to an existing one. But what we haven't covered so far is how you actually specify the colors inside the color scheme while you're modifying them or editing them. And it turns out Sublime has a few different ways that you can specify colors. So in today's video, we're going to cover all of the ways that you can specify colors in your color scheme. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Oda Nerd here. Welcome to this video on specifying colors in your Sublime Text color scheme. Now, we have talked a lot so far about what color schemes are, how they work, how we could create one from scratch or augment an existing one. But what we haven't covered is how do we specify colors in our color schemes? And it turns out there's quite a few different ways for us to specify those colors, and we're going to cover all of them in this video. Now, remember, there is official documentation on colors and color schemes in Sublime Text that's linked down in the description of this video and in all of the videos in this video series. Now, before we can jump in and discuss all of the various ways that we can specify colors, we need to take a very quick diverge off into the idea of the two color models that are available to us when we're working with colors in Sublime Text, and that is the RGB color model and the HSL color model. Now, you may already be familiar with those if you're, say, a web developer, graphic designer, or are otherwise just familiar with them. And in that case, you can jump to the time code that's on the screen right now to jump directly to how you specify colors in your Sublime Text color scheme. Otherwise, let's talk a little bit about color models. The first color model we're going to talk about is the RGB color model, or red, green, blue, and this is very prevalent not just in Sublime but just in software in general. So you're probably very familiar with the concept of this color model and how it works. And essentially what it is it allows us to take a value of red and green and blue and add them together to combine them to come up with a particular color. And we have a range of each of those three values that we can provide, anywhere from 0, which is none of that color in the mix, all the way up to 255, which is as much of that color as we could possibly add. So we can see here right now that the three sliders are set all the way to the left. The amount of colors those have are 0, and as a result, there is no red, no green, no blue, no color. The color is black. But we can see here that as I slowly bring the blue slider up, the amount of blue in the color becomes more enhanced until eventually we end up with the bluest color we can get because we have pure blue. If we start rendering in some red in here to add some extra red to this color, we can see that as we go along, the color becomes more and more purple until it becomes the most vivid purple there can be, which is magenta in this case. And if we were to adjust the green slider, we're adding green into the color. And as we start getting this closer to the top, we get the color white, because whereas absolutely none of every color is black, having as much as possible of all colors that added together ends us up at white. And of course, we could use any values inside of here to generate colors. And we can see here as I slide this around, all of those sliders change, showing us the relative mix of those three different types of colors as they're being added together. And we could maybe end up somewhere in the vicinity of an orangey type color like so by using this configuration of colors. Now, this is standard RGB. Now, what you might be more familiar with if you're working with RGB in this case, particularly if you're a web designer, is the idea of specifying these three values, the red, the green, and the blue, not as values from 0 to 255, but instead as hexadecimal values, where 0 is none and 255 is represented by the value FF. And we can do that by swapping this to hex sliders. And we can see here that the red value is FF. That's the maximum. The other two values are 77 and 20. Those are hexadecimal values. And we can see the hex code for the entire color, which is FF7720. That's probably something you're familiar with if you've done web design or worked in software that allows you to specify colors. And this is two of the different ways that we can actually specify colors in Sublime Text, using the RGB color model and using either decimal values or hexadecimal values as we see here. Now, the second color model that we can use to specify our colors when we're working in Sublime text color schemes is the HSL color model. Now, this is also fairly common, the same as RGB. In my experience, you see it more in graphic design type software when you're specifying colors and less in other places, but that is just my own personal perception, and you probably are familiar with this from a variety of other places. HSL works on a different concept than the RGB color model, whereas in RGB, we're modeling colors by saying how much of each of the three primary colors should be added together to come up with the final value. HSL depends more on how we as humans actually perceive color. So the three values here are the hue of the color, i.e., what color it actually is, the saturation of the color, which you can think of as how vivid that particular color is, and the lightness of the color. How light is it? How dark is it? And the values here are working a little bit differently than they are in RGB. So first, let's talk about the hue value. The hue of this is specifying the color that we're actually dealing with. And whereas in the RGB system, those values range from 0 to 255, here, the value of hue ranges from 0 to 360 because it represents a number of degrees around a color wheel. And that is visualized on the screen here. The value 0 represents the right-hand side of the color wheel, which is the color red. And as the value of the hue increases, the location on the color wheel circles around the wheel until eventually at 360 it comes back to where it started. So we can see here that if I grab this and slowly start sliding it around, the color is changing behind us, the hue is changing, but the other values are staying the same. And as we circle back around and the value gets bigger, when we get closer and closer to 360, we end up back at red. And 360 and 0 are the same relative color. They're both red. It sort of wraps around at that point. So the first thing we would specify here is how what color it is we want to work with. So let's go ahead and leave that there. And I'm going to switch this over to sliders so we can see the other two values here. Now, the second value that we're concerned with is the saturation of this color, which is how much of that color there is, or how vivid is that color. And this is a value that is a percentage. Anywhere from 0%, there is no color, none of this hue at all, which is, as we can see, the value gray. There's no color in this image. We've said there's absolutely no red. The color is gray, all the way up to a value of 100, which is 100% of this hue. This is as saturated as this color can be. So as we can see, as we lower this value down, the color sort of gets a little bit lighter and closer to gray. And the last value here in the list is the lightness of this color. How bright is this color? This is also a percentage value that ranges from 0 to 100. And as we can see here, this is set currently at the value 50. That's right in the middle, because as you remove lightness from a color, it gets darker and darker, as one might expect when lightness is removed, until eventually, when there's no light, there's no color, and the color ends up being black. And the converse, as the lightness value increases, the color gets lighter and lighter and lighter until eventually it's so light that it is just the color white. And within this realm, we can specify the exact same colors as we might otherwise specify, but it can be a lot easier for you to use. If you want a orange color, you can dial the hue down to the relative area of the orange, and then you could also specify that the lightness of the value to specify how bright and how dark you want your orange to be, and how saturated that color is, and you can really dial in exactly the color that you're using. And this is a lot more intuitive than trying to gauge and guess how the RGB values are going to combine themselves together. Before we jump back to Sublime, I think it's worth pointing out that whether you use HSL or RGB is completely up to you. You can specify the exact same colors both ways. It's just how you're specifying them is different. For example, here we know that the hue of 23 with the saturation of 89% and the lightness of 54% gives us this particular orange value. But if I was to swap this to the hex sliders, the color has remained the same, but now we can see the red, the green, and the blue values in the RGB color model that are required to come up with this particular color. Now, which one of these is more intuitive is completely up to you and what you are more familiar with. Now, with that said, let's say, for example, you had two very similar colors, like two shades of this orange, and one was sort of darker than the other. It might be more intuitive to be able to note that the hue value is the same and it's just the saturation and the lightness that are changing, to know that these are the same color and exactly how they are changing, versus looking at the RGB values and trying to determine how those mix in your head. But you can come up with the same color, so which one you use is completely up to you. The other thing to cover here is the idea of transparency or opacity or alpha. These are all terms that refer to the same thing, which is how much can we see through a particular color. And if you can see through something, it is transparent to some degree. And if you can't see through it at all, we refer to it as being opaque. And this particular software refers to this as opacity. In Sublime Text, as we're going to see in just a second, it's referred to as the alpha of the color. And it's just saying how much of the underlying color or whatever is under the thing you're coloring can you see. And right now, this slider is set all the way to the right, which is 100% opacity, which is completely opaque. You can't see through it at all. It's like a brick wall. The other end of the slider is 0% opacity or completely transparent. It's completely invisible, this thing. You can't see it at all. Say, for example, the air. And all of the values in the middle are some amount of transparency, like a window, for example, or a piece of paper if you hold it up to the light and you can sort of see the shadows that are going on behind it. So we can see here that as I take this value and slowly slide the opacity down, we can see that we're starting to be able to see through this, what was previously an orange rectangle, to what's underneath it on the page. And what's underneath it on the page as we get all the way to the side is a white rectangle with my avatar on it. Here in this graphic software, we can use this to be able to specify how we can see through things. And in Sublime Text, we can use this in our colors by way of an alpha channel to specify how much of the background color we can see through the foreground. Now that we know a little bit more about the color models that are available to us when we're choosing colors and how those work, we can take a look at how we can specify colors. Now here I am using a simple patch file onto the Monokai.sublime color scheme so that we can apply some simple colors and see them applied. This is something we covered in a previous video. And also I am, as is no surprise if you watch these videos, using package dev, which is providing enhanced syntax highlighting for this particular file type. There are, if you are using a Sublime color scheme formatted file, 7 different ways for you to specify a color in your color scheme. If instead you're working with a TM theme formatted file, there are 3 different ways instead, but we'll get to that in just a second. Now, the first 4 of these are related to using the RGB color model. So we can see here, the first one is the RGB hex. This is the red, green, blue in hexadecimal format. Has to have a hash at the beginning of it, and this is a full green color. So when we apply it, the foreground color changes to green. So anything in this buffer that isn't already covered by a color scheme definition rule somewhere else is turned to green. So the braces and the colons switch to being that particular green color. Now, instead of that, if we wanted to add an alpha channel, which again adds that ability to add translucency or transparency, however you want to think of that, to the value, you can add an extra value to the end and get the RGBA hexadecimal format. And in this case, we have done that with an alpha channel of 44 hex, but with the same green. So we'll see that the color still changes to green, but it is a darker green now because we can see that background color behind it. And if you wanted to use RGB, but you don't want to use hex to do it, if you want to use decimal values, you can do something like this. You can use the RGB function, and here you specify the red, green, and blue values as regular decimal values instead of hexadecimal values. So that's going to change our background color for us like so. And as you might expect, if you're interested in having an alpha value in using RGB, you can use the RGBA function. Now here, the alpha value takes a value between 0.0 and 1.0. So I'm going to save this, and we can see with an alpha value of 0.8, there's not a lot of transparency on this color. It's just a little bit transparent. So we see a very vivid green color here in the buffer. But if I was to change this to 0.2, it's now a very transparent or translucent. And so we can see more of that background color behind it, and it becomes less vivid. And we can also, of course, specify colors using the HSL color model, and we can do that by using the HSL function specifier here. So here, the values are hue, saturation, and lightness. The hue is going to be a value between 0 and 360, which is that rotation around the color wheel as we just saw. And the saturation and lightness are going to be percentage values, again, as we just saw. And we know that the hue of 0 is the right-hand side of the color wheel. So this should change the gutter to be a red color, and we can see it's at 100% saturation, so it should be as red can possibly be, but with 20% lightness, so it should be a pretty dark red. And when we apply it, we see that is in fact the case. And we might be interested in, again, adding an alpha value to this. So here we can change the value of the gutter foreground, and we can see we are using the hue of 0, which is red, with 50% saturation, so not as much red as it could be, and 60% lightness, so it's kind of dark. And we have applied an alpha value of 1.0 here, which is not transparent at all. So we can see that value, that color right there. But we could, of course, change this down to be, say, 0.5, and that's going to make that color 50% transparent. It's going to end up making that color even darker still because we can see the background behind it, and we can see that happening right there. And the last way, the seventh way that you can specify colors is by color name. And these aren't arbitrary color names. These are from the CSS color name specification, and there's a list of those in the color scheme documentation that's linked in the description of the video. So we can see here coral changes in this particular rule the keyword .other color to be the coral color, which is that one. We could also change it to this to specify the color wheat, which is a more muted color, a sort of an off-white color. Now, these are the 7 ways that you could do this if you're using a Sublime color scheme formatted file. If instead you're using a TM theme formatted file, then what's available to you are the RGB and RGBA hex format, so you can use the hexadecimal values with and without an alpha channel, and you can specify colors by name, but instead of being CSS color names, they're X11 color names instead. That's an X server standard. And although there is some overlap in the names of colors in using the X11 colors versus the CSS colors, the colors themselves don't line up directly. So keep that in mind. And of course, in the documentation linked in the description, if you follow through to the legacy TM theme formatted documentation, there's a link to those colors that are down at the bottom of the file as well. Now, along with being able to specify these colors in these 7 ways, one other way that we can do this, and this is again only available to us if we're using a Sublime color scheme, is by way of variables. So I am going to do this and save the file, and we see those values change to blue. And the reason for that is up at the top of the file, we have a variable with the name of primary set to a CSS color of Dodger blue, and our rule is saying that the color is whatever the value of the variable primary is. Now, this is very valuable and powerful as a technique in your color scheme, because if you're going to use the same colors multiple times, then instead of specifying them all over everywhere, you could create a variable of your own choosing and use that as we're doing here. And then if you decide you don't want the things that were Dodger blue to be that blue, if you wanted them to be Azure blue instead, all you have to do is change the variable in one place. Everything will immediately change. If you don't like it, you can change it back with no problem. You can tweak those colors up as you see fit. Variables are also a very valuable technique because apart from these ways of specifying colors directly, as we've seen here, Sublime also has a very powerful color modification function that allows you to take existing colors and blend them and mix them with other colors, changing their hue, saturation, lightness, alpha values, even blending other colors with them, which gives you an immense amount of power in defining a base variable and then defining essentially tints of that color, lighter, darker variations of that color for uses in other places. And if you're interested in that, then you should watch the next video. So as we can see, we have quite a few different ways we can choose from when we want to input colors into our color scheme. And you may immediately be asking yourself, is there any inherent benefit in using one of these formats over another? And the answer to that question is yes, whichever one you are most comfortable working in. You're going to get the same colors out of it at the end of the day, no matter which one of the methods that you use. So pick the one that you are most comfortable with, the one where when you look at it in the file, you understand what's going on. Now, with that said, as we mentioned very briefly at the end of this video, Sublime has a very powerful color modification system in place that allows you to create new colors out of existing colors that you have already created and used elsewhere in your color scheme. And this can be of immense benefit in setting up a color scheme with similar colors and being able to tweak and modify and edit colors in just one place instead of having to edit them all throughout your color scheme. But in order to see that, you're going to have to hang around for the next video. So if you haven't already done so, please use those buttons to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate so you don't miss out on that video when it comes. Remember, you can always use the comment section down below if you have any questions, comments, requests for clarification, or suggestions for other Sublime Text topics. But until that next video, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.